Let's talk Arthurian literature and medieval history. So hi, I'm Jean if you haven't watched any of my videos before. Now I am an ancient historian by trade, but I recently announced here online that in May of this year, 2025, assuming you're watching this in 2025, I have a medieval fantasy novel coming out with Penguin Michael Joseph, which is a reimagining of Arthurian legend, specifically from the perspective of the Lady of the Lake, as the title kind of gives away. That is literally the title. And on my video announcement, I got quite a few questions and requests for a video dedicated to the books that were my research material. So the medieval literature, the Arthurian romances that I pulled from, that inspired me, and I assume the non-fiction texts that I also used during my research process. So I thought it'd be fun to sit down and talk about both of those things. I'm splitting this video into two sections. The first is going to be the medieval literature itself, and then the second is going to be the modern non-fiction, which is both talking about Arthurian literature as well as more generally medieval history. Although I do want to add a couple of caveats here. This is all from the perspective of an enthusiast. Like I mentioned, I am a historian by trade, but I'm an ancient historian, and while you can certainly see the influence of ancient cultures on both medieval literature and Arthurian romances, I mean the Romans settled in Britain and that comes up in my book, I very much approached this project and my reading of medieval history and Arthurian literature as somebody who didn't necessarily know a lot to begin with and was just really interested in the topic. But also, I suppose, as somebody from Scotland and somebody from Britain who partly grew up on these tales. These tales are a big part of the folklore and mythological tradition of the country that I'm from. And of course, like many of you, I grew up consuming media that was either inspired by those stories or was those stories. So yeah, that all played a part. And then of course it goes without saying that this is not an exhaustive list of medieval literature or medieval non-fiction. This is just stuff that I think is interesting, that I read during my research process or beforehand, that I think has bearing on my novel and just more generally the understanding of this era and this genre of mythology, shall we call it. These are just the books that I enjoyed, that I found interesting, that I think you might find interesting, that had influence on me when I was writing and perhaps helped me better understand the era I was writing in. Although again, I should also probably mention that my book is not a historical fiction book, it is a historical fantasy, and therefore it of course diverges from perhaps the reality of what life might have been like in a time period which we can't even pinpoint. And this leads me into the first section of this video, which is all about the medieval literature itself. And something I think is really interesting and worth noting when you start picking up medieval literature and the Arthurian romances, which is a genre of literature which spans hundreds and hundreds of years, is that these are people from one medieval era writing about mythological and legendary figures from a much earlier medieval era, which doesn't always mesh or like gel with our understanding of the realities of history. So you're often seeing the sensibilities of one era transposed onto another era, or you're seeing a romanticization of one era by a later era. And one of my favourite examples to give for understanding this contrast and understanding where this can sort of like mislead you if you're looking for history in these books is that Camelot, the famous castle in which Arthur resides and which many of the tales of Arthurian legend take place, is supposedly this huge, impressive stone structure. Yet the period in which these legends would have taken place, which is sort of during the end of Roman settlement in Britain, during the height of the Brythonic Celtic kingdoms, and during the influx of Anglo-Saxons coming into Britain. It was not called Britain then, I'm just using Britain now for ease for everybody to understand where I'm talking about. There were not stone castles, like building castles out of stone, building large structures out of stone in the way that Camelot is depicted was not a thing. So that's my like fun example, I think, of demonstrating how sometimes trying to write, at least for me, a historical fantasy novel inspired by literature which isn't necessarily even giving you an accurate portrayal of a historical period can be a little bit overwhelming, but also in a sense quite exciting because you can kind of go in lots of different directions. But yeah, let's talk more about the literature itself. So my starting point for the Arthurian legends in terms of medieval literature is what I believe is a lot of people's starting point, and that is the work of Thomas Malory, aka Le Morte d'Arthur. This is not the earliest book I'll be talking about in this video though. It actually dates to around the 15th century and it was written in Middle English, and it's a relatively accessible work in terms of like picking it up. There are so many different editions of it. This one here is the Flame Tree Press edition, which they've titled Tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, although I actually have a second edition which was my dad's, and you can read it in the Middle English, which as somebody who's not an expert in this period, I still find relatively accessible if you're willing to maybe like look up some words. But you can also find modern English adaptations and translations of this work. And let me tell you, this book is just like chock-a-block full of Arthurian legends. There's a very short few sections on King Uther in the beginning, who is King Arthur's father, and then the sort of like main crux of the narrative begins with Arthur's childhood, his drawing of the sword from the stone, his becoming king of the Britons, not of Britain, of the Breton, which is a Celtic subgroup which would have occupied parts of modern day England, Wales and Scotland. Introduction to the various knights that we then know from his round table, his relationships with those knights, his family, his queen Guinevere, and of course his advisor, the magician Merlin. And it's kind of impossible to summarise this book when it covers so much. Like, it covers so much, and it's the kind of book where you can sort of dip in and out. If you have like a good understanding of Arthur's early days and you want to read a little bit more of his time post Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, for example, then you can maybe like flip to that section because it is quite chunky. But it is the sort of go-to book on Arthurian romances for a reason. Like, there's a lot in here. It's not the definitive book on Arthurian legends, but it's certainly one of the most all-encompassing and accessible texts, and for that reason I do highly recommend it as a starting place if you're looking for something quite like chunky. Now from here on out, everything else I'm going to talk about predates this book, and in part was an influence and an inspiration on this book. In some senses, Thomas Malory was compiling everything that already existed about Arthurian legends and trying to string together this one long narrative. However, they don't always work together. If you're taking the different medieval texts, just like with many mythologies, there's contradictions, there's impossibilities, there's things that just cannot coexist, and for that reason things change and meld, and they're adapted to the time in which they're being told, the setting in which they're being told, and the teller who is telling them, and their like personal motivations for like what they want to say with that story. And that's the same of the past as it is of the present. But one of the biggest influences, at least I gather from my research on Thomas Malory, are two bodies of work known as the Vulgate cycle and the post-Vulgate cycle. Now I'm not going to talk a lot about those books because they are not accessible as far as I'm concerned for like an everyday reader, and I don't necessarily mean that in the sense of like reading them, I mean in getting your hands on them. So the Vulgate and post-Vulgate cycle were originally written in French, and there is like only one English translation, so like if you are an English reader like me, that is from the 20th century. It's not widely distributed, it's not available in e-copy, so you either have to buy a lot of books that get really expensive because there's quite a few volumes, or you'll have to find like a large well-stocked library like a national library, which is what I did to access them. And as important as I'm sure they are to medieval and Arthurian scholars, I don't necessarily think that the everyday reader needs to like go to all that effort to seek them out, although perhaps if you read French then they are a little bit more accessible. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Please don't come for me if you're an Arthurian scholar, I'm sorry. But another influential French writer re the Arthurian legends was Chrétien de Troyes, who was working in the 12th century CE, and he wrote a number of Arthurian romances, 5 to be precise, as well as other works, some of which survive, some of which doesn't. He has like a really interesting back catalogue. But the work that was the biggest influence on me and might be of the most interest to you is the one that is commonly known as Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, named as thus because of an incident in Arthurian legend in which Lancelot basically hides in a cart in order to rescue Guinevere. And again, I think this book is reasonably accessible even if you don't read French, because it's been translated a number of times over the years, and I actually read it on archive.org, which is a free online library, so you know, you can literally go read it right now. It's that easy, and it's a really fun narrative. It obviously doesn't encompass everything about Arthurian legend, and it focuses in on Lancelot rather than Arthur, although for me as a researcher and a writer, I was just looking for stories of Guinevere, Morgan and the Lady of the Lake. That was all I cared about. But because of that, it's shorter, it gives you a taste of these stories, and it kind of narrows it into like this one Arthurian romance, which can be very entertaining and illuminating, and I think it's a really great place to start. Plus, if you like it, you can check out more of Chrétien de Troyes' work. Then another significant 12th century writer who influenced my work and is an important source for Arthurian legend is Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was a Welsh writer. And there are two works in particular I want to talk about. The first of which is Vita Merlini, or The Life of Merlin, which was originally written in Latin, but again has been translated into English and I'm sure many other languages various times. So like there's a lot of English translations out there, and I'll link the one that I read down below, as with all of these works. But the title of this one's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? It is The Life of Merlin. It is the story of Merlin from his early years, his service of Uther and Arthur, his relationships with Morgan Le Fay and Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, etc, etc. And one thing I find interesting more generally when you start reading medieval literature and reading about Merlin is that he actually was quite a significant player pre-Arthur, and that he was quite a significant player in Uther's court, which is something that I think, you know, like Disney films like The Sword of the Stone erase a little bit from like the cultural memory of Merlin. Like, he isn't even around for all of Arthur's reign, but he is around for quite a long time before Arthur's reign. But of course a very interesting figure, and one that I think you might be surprised by when you read the medieval literature, based on I think like some of our popular perceptions of him. And then secondly, by Geoffrey of Monmouth, is The History of the Kings of Britain, or as I believe the original title reads, On the Deeds of the Bretons. And this was also written in Latin and is very much presented as a historical work, like it is going through significant figures and rulers in the history of what is now Britain, and it was taken as historical fact for a really long time after it was written. For hundreds of years people referred to this as a piece of history, although from my understanding modern scholars do not consider it particularly historically accurate now, and instead you might want to think of it more as a sort of like legendary mythological history. But again, amidst those rulers are Uther and Arthur, and you also see the appearance of figures like Merlin once again. So if you're looking for more influential texts on the Arthurian canon, this one is absolutely worth checking out. You can just read parts of it, or you can try and read the whole thing if you really desperately want to. Now, from the perspective of me as a writer, I would say those are the works that were the biggest influences on me in a sort of active sense. Of course, I think like everything you read influences you in a more passive sense that you might not even be conscious of. And if and when you read The Lady of the Lake, you'll notice that my version of Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, hails from Dalriada, which is a kingdom in the north, what is now called Scotland. And there are definitely more general influences that stem from the Scottish folklore that I grew up with and have read as an adult. But if you'd like a video just more generally on Celtic and Scottish folklore, then let me know, that's something I can do. Then if you're just more generally interested in stories of King Arthur, or stories which influenced King Arthur, a couple I would recommend are the Welsh epic known as the Mabinogion, which is a Middle Welsh account of various different Welsh legends, but including a version of Arthur that may have existed alongside King Arthur, who is a warlord. So that's really interesting to see how there's influences at play there. Or for those who are interested in more broadly the Knights of the Round Table, Gawain and the Green Knight, although he's not part of the round table at the beginning of that narrative, is a really entertaining Middle English medieval poem which recounts a year in the life of Gawain after he encounters the infamous Green Knight, and again very widely accessible because there's been so many translations of it. I for one really enjoy Simon Armitage's translation if you're looking for one, but yeah, again I think it's a book you can access quite easily. So that I would call a very brief run through of some of the most significant pieces of Arthurian literature, and some which you might be interested in reading and some which influenced me as a writer. But if you'd like more context for the medieval era, the people that wrote these stories, as well as the period in which these stories take place and the influences on them, I'm going to talk more about non-fiction next. So as a historian more broadly, and as a folklorist, somebody who studies mythology and folklore and compiles it from various different eras, which is what I do in my everyday life, I have to recommend this book. I think this is a great book if you're interested in both Arthurian legends and more broadly European mythology. That is From Olympus to Camelot, The World of European Mythology by David Lemming. This is a short book, it's an accessible book, it's an interesting book, it covers quite a range of subjects. But I also think it makes you consider that none of these historical periods or mythologies are entirely disjointed from one another. These are people who moved, these are people who crossed borders, these are people who founded new kingdoms, who, you know, influenced one another, who shared culture and religion. And once you start reading the Arthurian legends, you might start to notice the influence of, for example, ancient Greek and Roman religion and mythology on them. At least that's something I was very aware of as an ancient historian, and I think it's something worth bearing in mind, that while we, you know, set quite firm delineations on periods in history from antiquity to the medieval era, etc., that's not necessarily how the world actually works, and there is definitely interaction at play. And if you do read The Lady of the Lake, you'll definitely see that the Romans are mentioned more than once in there. Not necessarily re-Arthurian legend though, but if that itself is a topic you're more interested in, say the influence of the Romans on what is now considered Britain, because there is chronological crossover between Arthurian legend and Roman settlement in Britain, then this is a really good book. This is Sacred Britannia, The Gods and Rituals of Roman Britain by Miranda Aldhouse Green. Probably don't need to say any more about it, the title is pretty self-explanatory. Similarly, not specifically Arthurian, but two little books I think are really great introductions to issues that are relevant when you're studying or reading or learning or writing about this era are these two books from the Very Short Introduction series by Oxford Press, one of which is The Celts by Barry Cunliffe, a somewhat broad and meaningless term that means different things to different people, but historically when you're talking about the Arthurian legends, you're talking about various different Celtic subgroups, so that's interesting. And then there is The Anglo-Saxon Age by John Blair, which again, if you read the Arthurian legends, you'll notice that a lot of the people who Arthur is depicted as fighting off from his kingdom are the Anglo-Saxons, so there you go. But if I had to recommend two non-fiction texts specifically on Arthurian legends, it would be these two. These were two of the most influential books to me when I was writing The Lady of the Lake, and I think they're both absolutely fantastic and give really interesting, overlooked perspectives on Arthurian legend, because we talk about Arthurian legends, we call them Arthurian legends, but they're not all about Arthur, and in fact there are some absolutely incredible, fascinating women in these legends, which is something both of these books tackle. So first up we have King Arthur's Enchantresses, Morgan and Her Sisters in Arthurian Tradition by Caroline Larrington. So this book covers women including Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, Morgan Le Fay, Morgause, Anna, Queen of Orkney, women who wield magical power in the Arthurian legends, and what role they play, but also how that role changes, how their depictions change depending on what text you're reading over time, and their influences and the influence that they had, and it's absolutely brilliant. I love this book. As you can see, I did a lot of tabbing, but yeah, this book was a big influence on me. And then I also really enjoy Arthurian Women, edited by Thelma S. Fenster, which is actually an essay collection. So this has essays in it by various different Arthurian and medieval scholars on the women of Arthurian legend. And it takes mythological approaches, it takes historical approaches, it looks at them in the medieval text, and it also looks at their reception, which is a study I always find very, very interesting when looking at mythology, the way in which it has been continued to the way in which it has continuously been adapted, and maybe we have interacted with it as modern viewers of media or readers, etc. So I really like this book for the broad range of topics it covers. I think it's really, really interesting. But then of course, writing a medieval fantasy novel from the perspective of women in a vague medieval age, although fantastical, I wanted to read more about the lives of medieval women and attitudes towards medieval women, although of course those are going to change. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years and different places, and all of that is going to change and influence how women are perceived. Like, it's not all stagnant or homogenous. And the first book I read solely dedicated to that topic, and which I found very accessible, like this is a great introduction to the topic of medieval women's lives, is The Once and Future Sex: Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society by Eleanor Janega. Like, this book is not very long and it is very readable. Like, this is such a great book to just pick up, dive into. I don't think you need a lot of context for it, and you might find there are some surprises in there. I also enjoy how it connects this history to the lives of modern women. So I thought this was a great book. But if that is something you're interested in, I do have a few more books on medieval women. I have Medieval Women: A Social History of Women in England specifically. Eleanor Janega's book is more generally about Europe, from 450 to 1500. Look, a whole millennia of women's lives. This one definitely gets a bit more nitty gritty, but is also excellent. And one I have on audiobook is Femina: A New History of the Middle Ages Through the Women Written Out of It by Janina Ramirez, which again is a little bit chunkier. And a book that only came out recently, so, you know, had no influence on my writing process. The book was done long before that, but I just picked up and I'm really excited to read, so I thought I'd quickly mention it here, is Poet, Mystic, Widow, Wife: The Extraordinary Lives of Medieval Women by Hetta House. If this had come out whilst I was writing Lady of the Lake, I absolutely would have read it during the research process, but I'm still excited to read it now and continue learning a little bit more and garnering some new perspectives. But those are my reading recommendations for those who are interested in Arthurian legends and the history of medieval women. The books informed me as a fiction writer that I really enjoyed, and I think you might enjoy too. I hope this video was interesting. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you added some new books to your TBR. If you do have any more questions, I'm happy to try and answer them, so do leave them in the comments down below. And if the Lady of the Lake does sound like your cup of tea, I will also have pre-order links in the description box. So until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.